He leaned across the desk and said, "She's just my grandma. Don't let her sign anything until I get back." I looked up from the pen in my hand. The words weren't shouted, but they echoed through the bank like a slap. Just my grandma. Not Mrs. Blake, not even Grandma Ruth, just my grandma. As if I were some doddering relic who'd wandered in by mistake. The young woman behind the counter, Miss Patel, her name tag said, looked from him to me, then back again. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. My grandson, Henry, barely 24, had come in 5 minutes late to our appointment, smelling of cologne and irritation. Now he was speaking like I wasn't even in the room. I placed the pen gently on the desk, not because I was unsure, but because suddenly the tremor in my hands would look like weakness to him. "No," I said. Henry turned, one eyebrow already raised. "No. What?" "I said no," I repeated, my voice calm, but not soft. "You don't speak for me, Henry." He gave a little laugh, the kind you give when someone's being difficult, and you're trying to pretend they aren't. "Grandma, I'm just saying we should double-check the paperwork. It's a lot of money." "I know how much it is." I turned to Miss Patel. "Is there any legal reason I can't proceed?" She hesitated. Young, maybe late 20s, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, the funds are in your name and you have full authority. If you're sure." "I'm sure." Henry stepped forward, lowering his voice, but not enough. "This isn't a good idea. She's not thinking clearly. She's been stressed lately. You know how it is, old age." Miss Patel's eyes widened. She looked like she wanted to disappear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "If he says one more word, I'll file a complaint, and I'll do it in writing." There was a silence then, the kind that settles when something irrevocable has just been said. Henry stared at me, really stared, as if seeing me for the first time. I watched the shape of his mouth change, the tilt of his shoulders shift. The mask of politeness cracked just a little. "This isn't how we talked about it," he muttered. "No," I said. "It's how I decided it would be." He stood there for another second, caught between the instinct to keep performing and the panic of losing control. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned and stormed out. Miss Patel flinched as the glass doors clattered behind him. I looked down at the papers again. My hand hovered over the line. The ink from the pen had dried where I'd set it down. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blake," Miss Patel said carefully. "Do you want to take a moment?" I shook my head. "No, dear. I've taken too many moments in my life. It's time I moved." And I signed. The chair in my kitchen creaked the same way it had for 20 years, a small, familiar sound that reminded me of the things that hadn't changed. The sun through the window laid a pale square across the table, touching the edges of a blue and white teacup I hadn't used in months. I used it now, for me. I didn't cry on the way home. That part of me, the weeping part, had been put away long ago, after the third time Henry borrowed money with no intention of paying it back. After my son, Thomas, said I was overreacting when I asked about the loan agreements he'd promised to draw up. Today wasn't new. It was just final. I placed the signed paperwork on the table like a centerpiece, a transfer of funds, a legal designation, not the trust Henry thought he was getting, not the setup Thomas had quietly arranged with his friend at the accounting firm. No, this one was different. My name, my decision, my choice. I sipped my tea. It had cooled. The documents marked the beginning of the trust for Lily, my granddaughter, Henry's younger sister. She's the only one who asks how my knees are doing without looking at her phone. The only one who visits just to sit and talk, not to deliver a list of small favors that add up to the cost of someone else's life. Thomas would call soon. He'd be furious. He had a voice made for authority, clipped, clean, with a tone that made people listen. I used to listen too. For years, I let him talk circles around me. He said I wasn't equipped to handle the complexities of modern finance. Said he'd handle everything just like Dad would have wanted. But I remembered my husband, Harold, better than Thomas did. And Harold had never once told me to stay quiet. I stood up slowly, my hips stiff, and walked to the drawer near the fridge. The one they never noticed. They called it junk. But it held the backbone of this house. Spare keys, expired IDs, paper clips, tax receipts going back to 1987, and one manila envelope with the word "Do Not Sign" written in my own shaky hand. Inside was the paperwork Henry had pushed across the table last spring. "It's just a precaution," he said, "in case something happens. You know, dementia, stroke, anything." He said it so gently, like he cared, like he wasn't salivating behind his smile. I didn't sign. And I never would. I held the envelope in my hands now, staring at the dry ink of my warning. Do not sign. It wasn't written in fear. It was a promise. They thought I was fading. They spoke around me, not to me. They offered help with shopping, only to slip in requests. They praised my roast chicken, then sighed at the outdated oven. "Maybe it's time you moved into a condo," Thomas had said last month. "Something more manageable. We can help you sell." I remembered the look on Lily's face when I told her. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice fierce. "That's your home, Grandma. They just want the money." She saw it. She saw what they didn't want me to see. I sat back down, the envelope in my lap. Outside, the wind moved through the birch tree Harold planted the year we bought this house. Its leaves shimmered like small, silent bells. They thought I didn't notice, but I did. They thought I'd forgotten, but I hadn't. And now, for the first time in years, I was the one setting the terms. When my son talks to me, he uses a tone that reminds me of customer service. Polite, patted, as if I might break from too much clarity. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. Everything all right?" That's how Thomas opened our last real conversation, the one before today. He was standing in my living room, taking shallow sips from the coffee I made, glancing around like he was appraising furniture. He always pretended he wasn't in a rush, but his body betrayed him. One foot tapping lightly, the fingers of his free hand drumming on his knee. "Everything's fine," I'd answered. He waited, as if I might add something. I didn't. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to go over some things. Nothing urgent. Just financial housekeeping." That was always how it started. A word like housekeeping instead of control. He pulled out a leather folder. Inside, pages, graphs, his voice growing smoother the longer he talked. Projected returns, tax efficiencies. "We could consolidate your investments into a single portfolio," he said, as if I'd been mismanaging something. "Henry has a contact at Faulkner and Rowe. They handle high net worth clients. They'd treat you right." I remember the way he said that. Treat you right. Like I was a stray dog and he'd finally found me a good home. And I remember the thought that came next. One I didn't speak out loud at the time. "You're not trying to protect me, Thomas. You're trying to secure the inheritance early." I asked for time. He smiled like I was indulging myself, like he didn't mind waiting a little longer. That was 2 months ago. Since then, 3 follow-up emails, 1 dropped-off contract, and a visit from Henry with a folder already tabbed and highlighted. And then today, Today, Henry tried to stop me at the bank. Not out of worry, not out of care, but because he assumed I still belonged to them, that I was a resource they could manage. The truth is, I let that happen. For years. After Harold passed, I didn't know how to say no. Not to Thomas. Not to Henry. They'd show up in suits, talk fast, toss around words like capital gains and power of attorney, and I'd nod like I understood it all. At first, it felt like help. Then it started to feel like erasure. They spoke to financial advisors in my name, took calls from banks pretending they were authorized. "It's just easier, Mom," Thomas would say. "These things are complicated." But so was being a widow at 60. So was balancing a checkbook while grieving, dealing with probate, and learning how to restart a boiler Harold always handled. I figured it out. I figured everything out. But somehow, they made me feel like that version of me had died with Harold. Thomas is clever. Not warm, but clever. He knows how to make you feel like you're in charge while he rearranges everything behind the scenes. I think that's why he did so well in real estate. People trust him. He doesn't raise his voice. He just moves pieces until you're boxed in and don't realize it until you've already signed. But I didn't sign. Not this time. Tonight, I reheated soup. I let the spoon rest in the bowl while I stared at the phone. Thomas hadn't called yet. He would. I knew the rhythm of his attention. Silence, then pressure, then performance. He wouldn't yell. He'd explain. He'd make it sound like I was being emotional, maybe even manipulated by well-meaning outsiders. They always think someone else is influencing you when you stop obeying. I stood at the sink, rinsing the bowl. Outside, the wind was picking up. The light faded quickly this time of year. I used to mind it. Not anymore. Let the dark come. I know where the switches are. Lily arrived just after 7. No warning, no ceremony. Just a soft knock and her voice through the door. "Grandma? It's me." I opened it and found her standing there in scrubs, hair tied back, eyes tired but kind. She worked at the hospice downtown, long shifts, heavy stories, all of them kept quietly behind her lips. She never complained. She never came for anything, except today. "I was driving home," she said, stepping inside, "and I don't know. I felt like I should see you." There was always something uncanny in her timing, like she knew when I needed to be reminded that someone still saw me. Not the money, not the house. Me. I set the kettle on. She slipped off her shoes. We moved around each other in the kitchen like we always had. Comfortable, unhurried, familiar. "You look tired," I said. She smiled. "2 of our patients passed this morning. I just didn't want to go home and pretend like it was a normal day." I nodded, not with sympathy. She didn't want that, but with understanding. We sat at the table, the same table Henry had leaned over at the bank just hours ago. I poured the tea. She watched me closely. "I saw Henry's car at the bank this morning," she said finally. My hand didn't flinch. "Yes." She hesitated. "Was that about the trust?" I met her eyes. "No, it was about power." Lily's mouth curled just slightly. She understood. "Does he know?" she asked. "Not yet." She stirred her tea, thinking. "He'll be furious." "I know. Dad will too. I expect as much." She exhaled. "Good." I let out a sound, not quite a laugh, but something nearby. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. "I brought this. It's silly, but..." She placed it in front of me. A drawing, crayon, marker, childish and bright. One of the residents drew it before she passed, said it reminded her of home. It was a garden, a bench, 2 figures, One small, one old, holding hands. I told her I'd take care of it, Lily said softly. I touched the paper. My finger traced the lines of the little house in the corner. I didn't know the woman who'd drawn it, but I understood her completely. They think we get smaller with age, I murmured. That our needs shrink, our minds soften. They think dignity expires with usefulness. Lily said nothing. She didn't need to. I signed everything today, I told her. The trust, the revocation of that mess Henry wanted. It's all done. She looked at me, eyes wide. You really did it? I really did it. For a moment, her expression shifted. Not joy, not pride, but relief. Like something she'd been afraid to hope for had just arrived. I didn't do it for revenge, I said. Not even to punish them. I paused. I wanted something to go to someone who saw me as more than a balance sheet. Lily's voice was quiet. I always have. I reached across the table and took her hand. Hers was warm, calloused, steady. I held it for a while. Outside, the wind knocked softly at the windows. The kettle steamed behind us. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. The call came at 8:32 the next morning. I was in the garden picking the last of the fall tomatoes when the phone rang from the windowsill. I let it ring twice before wiping my hands on my apron and answering. Mother, Thomas said. No greeting, no preamble. Just that single word, clipped and sharp. Good morning, Thomas. I spoke with Henry. I assumed you would. He exhaled into the receiver. Not quite a sigh. More like a soft reset before launching into the tone he always reserved for bank tellers and building inspectors. Controlled, cold, educated. He told me what happened at the bank. What you did. Or didn't do, rather. I stayed quiet. I've learned over the years that silence unnerves men like Thomas more than shouting ever could. I think there's been some confusion, he continued. Some miscommunication. Henry was just trying to help. Henry told a bank employee that I wasn't competent to sign my own documents. Mother, you're twisting this. That's not... He said, and I quote, she's just my grandma. Don't let her sign. A pause. Then, I'm sure he didn't mean it the way it sounded. I'm sure he meant exactly what he said. Another silence, this one heavier. May I ask what you signed? He said finally. You may. I set up a trust. For Henry? For Lily? Dead air. She had no idea, I added. No expectations, no pressure, just kindness. Thomas's voice changed, just slightly, but enough. Mother, you don't understand the financial implications of... I understand more than you think, and I understand exactly why you're upset. I'm not upset, he snapped. He caught himself. I'm concerned. No, Thomas, you're disappointed, because the nest egg you thought you were circling just flew in another direction. You're being dramatic. No, dear, I'm being direct. There was a sound like he'd stood up from his chair. I imagined him pacing his home office, a coffee going cold on the desk beside his certificates. I've managed your finances for years, he said. Efficiently, transparently. You've controlled my finances for years. There's a difference. You're not thinking clearly. I laughed, a short, dry sound. That's the line you use when I stop agreeing with you. Mother, listen. No, I interrupted. You listen. I know what this house is worth. I know what's in the accounts Harold left. I know what the sale of the shares brought in. I know everything because I went back and found the papers you told me not to stress about. And I've made my own decisions. He was quiet again. Then, a quieter voice. So that's it? Yes. No discussion? There's nothing to discuss. And Henry? You're just cutting him out? I'm leaving behind what's earned, not what's expected. A long pause. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, he said at last. You've always been stubborn. No, I corrected. I've always been soft. You just mistook it for weakness. I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were trembling slightly, but not from fear, from clarity, the kind that settles in the bones once a decision is truly made. I went back outside and knelt in the garden, the soil warm beneath my knees. The tomatoes were slightly overripe, but I picked them all the same. Let them rot in the sun, I thought. I've wasted too much sweetness on people who never learn the taste of gratitude. I've never understood how people can ignore a woman's silence. They'll argue with your anger, dismiss your tears, sidestep your disappointment. But silence? They treat it like a pause instead of a statement. After that call with Thomas, I didn't hear from him for 4 days. Not even a message. No email, no knock on the door, not even a carefully worded voicemail from Henry pretending everything was fine. I wasn't surprised. Silence, for men like them, isn't a response. It's an inconvenience. I spent those days doing ordinary things. Laundry, though there wasn't much to wash, sorting through old drawers, watering the plants. I found a loose floorboard under the hallway carpet and spent the better part of a morning prying it up just to see if anything was hidden there. Nothing was. But it felt good to look. On the 3rd day, I walked to the post office. It was brisk out, the air cold and dry in my throat, but I liked it. I liked moving at my own pace. A woman passed me on the sidewalk and smiled with recognition. Still walking everywhere, Ruth? I nodded. As long as my knees let me. She laughed and said, "Good for you," and we kept moving in opposite directions. That's the kind of conversation I cherish now. Simple, direct, without hidden meaning or agendas. On my way back, I took a detour through the small park near the elementary school. Children ran past, shouting, laughing, throwing leaves in the air, like they didn't know the world would ever disappoint them. I sat on the bench Harold used to favor, the one near the birch trees. He used to say, "It's not the trees that change, it's how we see them." At the time, I thought it was just another one of his quiet philosophies. Now I understand. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text. From Henry. "Can we talk?" No hi, Grandma. No apology. Just that flat, unpunctuated sentence. I stared at it for a long time before replying. About what? The response came quickly. "You know what? I want to clear the air." Clear the air. Another phrase used by people who never breathed the same air as you in the first place. I didn't reply. That evening, I took out the folder with my will. Not because I was angry. I wasn't. Not anymore. But because I was ready. Ready to remove the names that no longer felt like family. Ready to put my legacy where it mattered. There was one more name I hadn't told Lily about yet. Maya. She's the daughter of my late friend, Evelyn. A quiet girl. Works with disabled children, lives modestly, never asked me for anything. But last year, when my furnace broke in December, and I couldn't get through to Thomas or Henry, it was Maya who showed up with an electric heater and soup. She stayed that night, just in case I needed anything. Never made a big deal about it. Never asked for thanks. Sometimes kindness doesn't come from blood. Sometimes it comes from simple decency. I opened the drawer, took out a fresh notepad, and began drafting the changes I'd discuss with my lawyer. Lily, Maya, and a portion to the women's shelter where I used to volunteer before my hip surgery. Thomas always said I was too emotional when I brought up things like legacy. But this wasn't emotion. This was math. Tallying up years of giving and finally choosing who to give to. Not out of guilt or obligation, but respect. The lawyer's office still smelled like paper and old carpet cleaner. Nothing had changed in 20 years. Same brown leather chairs, same flickering light over the coat rack, same solemn receptionist who always looked like she was calculating the weight of your secrets. "Mrs. Blake?" she greeted me, standing slightly as I walked in. "Mr. Hadley is ready for you." Walter Hadley had been Harold's lawyer, and then mine. We weren't friends, but we had an understanding. He explained everything plainly, and I never wasted his time. That's how I liked it. He stood when I entered, thinner than I remembered, with more scalp showing through his combed-back hair, but his handshake was still firm. "Ruth," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "you look well." "I look like someone who's finally thinking clearly," I said. He smiled, only a little. "I hear that more than you'd think." I handed him the notepad. "I need to update the will, and the trust is finalized, but I want to ensure certain people are no longer listed anywhere they don't belong." He read silently. I watched his eyebrows shift, not in surprise, just quiet acknowledgement. "No Thomas? No Henry? But Lily and Maya, yes, and a portion to the shelter." "Yes," he nodded. "Any assets still jointly tied to Thomas?" "The old insurance policy. I want it changed or terminated." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder with my name on the tab. The pages inside were already familiar to me. I'd read them enough times in recent weeks to know every paragraph, every clause. "Some of these documents name him as your financial representative," Walter said, turning a page. "You gave him limited power of attorney in 2015. Shall we revoke that entirely?" "Burn it," I said. Then I paused. Figuratively. Walter didn't flinch. "Understood." He began drafting the new provisions. His pen scratched steadily across the paper while I sat back and looked at the painting behind his desk. A landscape, all muted browns and grays, a cabin surrounded by bare trees. I remembered the first time I was in this office. Harold had just passed. I was wearing a coat too heavy for the weather and holding a folder I didn't understand. Thomas sat beside me doing all the talking. Walter addressed him more than me. "Today," I spoke, and Walter listened. "There's one more thing," I said when he finished writing. "I want to put the house in Lily's name, not after I'm gone. Now." He looked up. "That's a significant move. Are you sure?" "Yes." He didn't ask why. I appreciated that. "Very well. We'll draft a deed transfer and go over the property tax implications. She'll need to sign as well." "She will," I said, "but she won't know until it's done. I want it to be a gift, not leverage." Walter's pen moved again. I left the office with a thick folder of documents and the feeling that something long overdue had finally been set in motion. Outside, the wind was biting. I pulled my scarf tighter and walked down the sidewalk slowly, deliberately. My legs ached, but I didn't care. A text buzzed in my coat pocket. "Are you angry with me? Can we meet? Henry." I didn't reply. A second message followed. "Please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect you." That one made me pause. Not because it softened me. It didn't. But because it confirmed what I already knew. He wanted access, not forgiveness. Outside the cafe across the street, a young woman was helping her toddler back into a stroller. She didn't notice me, But I noticed her, the way she fixed the little boy's hat, tightened the straps, whispered something only he could hear. Love without transaction. That's what it looked like. I used to believe that was what I had with my family. I was wrong. But I could still choose how my story ended. Not with a will read behind my back by men in suits, but with clarity. My voice, my decision, my hands signing the paper. I clutched the folder tighter. Let them call. Let them panic. Let them realize that the woman they thought they could quietly contain just signed herself free. The day Lily found out, it was raining. The kind of soft, steady rain that makes everything feel quieter. She came over with a bag of groceries, unasked, like she often did. Eggs, milk, a few apples, a loaf of that seeded bread I like. No fuss. No questions. Just care. Handed over the threshold like it was nothing. "I saw your light on," she said, brushing raindrops from her hair. "Figured you might be up." "I'm always up," I smiled. "Just not always moving." She kicked off her shoes and followed me into the kitchen, where I'd set the kettle to boil. The paperwork was still on the table. I hadn't meant to leave it out. Not because it was a secret, but because I didn't want the moment to feel like a transaction. She saw it almost immediately. Her eyes scanned the top sheet, and I could see the confusion forming before she spoke. Is this about the house?" I nodded. "Why does it have my name on it?" "Because it's yours." Lily blinked. "Grandma, I put it in your name. The lawyer filed it this morning. It's official." She sat down slowly, as if her legs had forgotten how to work. "You're giving me the house?" "Yes. But why? I didn't ask for it. I never—" "That's why." She was quiet. Her fingers touched the edge of the paper like it might vanish. "I don't understand," she whispered. I poured the tea and set her cup in front of her. Then I sat down across from her, hands folded. "I've spent most of my life giving things to people who never said thank you," I said. "And when they did, it came with conditions, or expectations, or worse, silence." She looked up, and I saw it in her face. That ache, that reflex to argue, to say, "But they love you, Grandma." I shook my head gently. "Don't defend them. Not here, not now." She stayed quiet. "I'm not doing this because you need a house," I said. "I'm doing it because this is the one place I've felt like myself. And I want it to go to someone who saw me, really saw me before it was convenient." Lily looked at me for a long time. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't know what to say," she said softly. "You don't have to say anything." She sat back and wiped her eyes. "Dad is going to lose his mind." "I know. And Henry. I've stopped worrying about Henry." She gave a weak laugh, then caught herself. "I feel guilty." "Don't. But you were kind when no one else was. You came over when they forgot my birthday. You checked on me during the storm last winter. You didn't roll your eyes at the way I still write checks. And you never asked for anything. That's just being decent." "No," I said. "That's being good. And I won't let this house become a reward for bad behavior." Lily looked down at the papers again. "Are you sure about this?" I reached across the table and turned the first page toward her. "Sign it." She hesitated, then picked up the pen I kept by the phone. Her signature was careful, straight-backed, steady. When she finished, she looked up with eyes wide and glassy. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," I said. "Thank you for reminding me I'm not invisible." The rain kept falling outside, steady and soft. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. The house felt warm, and for the first time in a long time, my kitchen didn't feel like a waiting room. It felt like it had purpose again. Thomas showed up unannounced 3 days later. Not a phone call, not a text. Just the sound of his tires in my gravel driveway and the knock. 2 sharp raps, then one softer. Like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or polite. I didn't rush to open the door. When I did, he was standing there in a tailored coat, hair slicked back, eyes already narrowed. Not in suspicion, in calculation. Like a man walking into a boardroom, not his mother's home. "Can I come in?" "You already have?" He stepped inside, scanning the hallway like something might be different, as if the furniture might whisper what he'd missed. "I thought we should talk, face to face," he said. I nodded and walked into the kitchen. He followed. There were still traces of Lily's visit, a mug drying in the rack, the folded deed papers on the corner of the table. I didn't move them. He sat across from me, not waiting to be asked. I noticed he didn't take off his coat. "I'm going to be direct," he began. "When are you not?" He ignored that. "You've made some choices recently that affect not just you, but the entire family. And I think it's important you understand the full consequences." I said nothing. "You've removed both Henry and myself from the will." I nodded. "You've also transferred the house to Lily." "Correct. Do you realize what kind of financial strain you're putting on the family? On your grandson?" I smiled, but it wasn't kind. "Henry is 34, not 14. Thomas leaned back, crossing his arms. "That house is worth over 400,000. That's generational wealth, Mother. I know exactly what it's worth." "Then why would you—" "Because for years, you treated me like an obligation wrapped in potential profit. Because when Harold died, you didn't grieve. You calculated. Because every holiday turned into a negotiation. And because I finally realized that being needed is not the same as being loved." Thomas looked away for a moment. "I never meant to make you feel that way. You didn't make me feel anything. You just acted. I did the feeling." His voice lowered. "You're letting emotions make legal decisions." "No," I said. "I'm letting history guide legal decisions." A silence fell between us. He broke it, but softer this time. "Why Lily? She's the only one who didn't treat me like a speed bump on the way to my estate." He flinched at the word. Estate. It made it too real, too final. "You could have talked to me," he said. "I did. For 20 years. You just weren't listening." His jaw tensed. "So what now? I tell Henry there's nothing coming his way?" "You tell him whatever you want. I've already told him nothing." Thomas stood. He didn't reach for me, didn't argue further, but his eyes, sharp and suddenly uncertain, lingered longer than they ever had before. "She'll waste it," he muttered. "Lily. She'll pour it into patience and charities and dreams." I stood too, looked him in the eye. "Good. Let the house finally belong to someone who builds instead of takes." He didn't answer, just turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that didn't echo. I didn't follow him to the window. I didn't wait for him to come back. I sat down in the chair he'd left empty and wrapped both hands around my teacup, still warm. Some goodbyes don't require words. Some closures happen in the spaces where expectation used to be. And this house, my house, finally felt like it had been closed to the wrong people and opened to the right ones. I went to the bank the next morning. Not because I had to. Everything was already signed, filed, secured. But because I wanted to see Richard. He'd been my financial advisor for nearly a decade and one of the few men I'd known who never spoke down to me. Never once asked if I needed someone else in the room. Never assumed Harold had been the brain behind our finances. He greeted me with a warm nod as I stepped into his office. "Mrs. Blake," he said, standing. "Or should I say, the most talked-about woman in our branch this week." I gave him a wry look. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes," he smiled. "We rarely see such a decisive redistribution of wealth." I sat across from him. "Well, I've decided I don't want to die famous for being generous. I want to live quietly for being fair." He nodded, folding his hands. "You're here to finalize the trust allocation? And to ask about a clause I'd like to add." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I want to ensure the funds are protected from anyone who might try to contest. I've heard stories. People claiming mental unfitness, undue influence." He nodded again. "It happens. More often than you'd like to think." "Well, I'd like to think ahead." He pulled out the file from the drawer, flipping to the relevant pages. "We can strengthen the language around your capacity at time of signing. Include the medical clearance you already provided from your physician. I can also add a no contest clause." "What does that mean?" "If anyone challenges the trust and loses, they're automatically disqualified from receiving anything, even if a court later decides otherwise." I smiled. Perfect. We spent the next half hour reviewing everything, line by line. Richard never rushed, never simplified. He treated me like someone capable of understanding their own worth. When we finished, he looked up. "May I ask something personal?" "Of course." "Why now?" I thought for a moment. "Because for too long, I was writing checks like apologies, buying peace, attention, forgiveness. And the thing about peace you buy? It never lasts." He leaned back, thoughtful. "And now I want to leave behind something that doesn't need my silence to be accepted." He smiled, not politely, but sincerely. "That's the best kind of legacy." As I walked out, I passed the reception desk, where a young man in a navy suit was typing something with great speed. He looked up as I passed and nodded respectfully. I didn't know his name. He didn't know mine. But I wondered if he'd heard the story yet. Of the old woman who stopped being the family wallet and started being the author of her own ending. Outside, the wind had shifted. Cooler, crisper. The kind of air that makes you walk faster, feel lighter. I crossed the street and paused in front of a cafe I used to visit with Harold. There was a new awning, a new name, but the smell of cinnamon and burnt espresso was the same. I stepped inside, ordered a tea, sat by the window, and I thought about all the things I'd paid for in silence. The tuition, the down payments, the retreats, the upgrades, the dinners, the second chances, all delivered without question, and all used up without thanks. They'd assumed the money came from nowhere. As if it hadn't been earned in late nights balancing accounts. As if I hadn't scrubbed the floors of Harold's shop on Sundays to save on cleaning staff. As if I hadn't driven through snowstorms to deposit checks by hand when his back gave out. And now, when the accounts were full, they circled me like a well-fed flock. Disappointed not because I was in danger, but because I was no longer pliable. Well, let them be disappointed. Let them tell their versions of the story at parties and in whispered complaints. I didn't need to defend myself. The deeds were signed. The papers were sealed. And the money, finally, was free of expectation. The first real fallout came with a voicemail. It was nearly midnight when the phone buzzed. I was already in bed, reading, an old mystery novel I'd read 3 times before, but still liked for its quiet sense of justice. The screen lit up with Henry's name, and I let it ring through. Seconds later, the voicemail icon blinked. I waited, made myself finish the chapter. Then I pressed play. "Grandma, it's me. I don't know where to start. I didn't know about the trust, about the house. Dad told me today. He was furious. I mean, really furious. He said you've completely shut us out." A long pause. I could hear him breathing, not steady. "I guess I thought we were family. I didn't think you'd do this without talking to me. I don't know what Lily told you, but this feels personal, and it's not fair." The message ended there. No apology, no recognition, just the typical pivot. Make it about betrayal, about being blindsided, about fairness. Not a word about what he'd said at the bank. The next morning, there were 3 more messages. Shorter, more frantic. "Why are you doing this? Please, we need to talk. This isn't you." But it was. It was me. Finally. I didn't respond. I had nothing left to explain. Instead, I walked to the local notary to deliver the signed deed copies for Lily. She'd get the final envelope next week. Formal, embossed, undeniable. She still didn't know about the rest. The shelter fund, the account for Maya, the clause I added to the will that barred anyone who challenged it from receiving a cent. Thomas would find out soon enough, and I had no doubt he'd try. When I came back home, I found something on my porch, a bouquet, white lilies and some expensive-looking eucalyptus, a card tucked between the stems. I know I messed up. Let me make it right. Henry. The handwriting was his, careful, dramatic, like a boy who still believed big gestures could undo small cruelties. I left the bouquet outside, not out of spite, but because I didn't want my house to smell like guilt. That evening, the doorbell rang. Once. Then again. I opened it to find Thomas standing there. Again. He didn't ask to come in this time. Instead, he held out an envelope. "This is from Henry," he said. "He wrote you a letter." I took it. Didn't open it. "He's struggling," Thomas added. "He made a mistake, but he's not a bad person." "No," I said quietly. "But he's your son." Thomas frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means he learned how to treat me by watching how you do." That silenced him. For a moment I saw something in his face, a flicker of doubt, of discomfort. But it passed quickly. "Do you want me to go?" he asked. "That's the first question you've asked that wasn't about money." He nodded once, then turned and walked back to his car. I sat on the porch with the unopened letter in my lap. It was strange how light it felt, how easy it was not to read it. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared about myself more than I cared about their approval. I'd spent years decoding their moods, anticipating their needs, staying quiet to keep the peace. But peace bought at the price of self-erasure isn't peace. It's performance. And the curtain had fallen. I watched the sunset through the branches of the birch tree Harold planted the summer after we bought this house. The same tree Henry climbed as a child, calling down to me like a king surveying his kingdom. Now the tree was old, strong, unmoved, just like me. The next day, the silence broke. Not with another visit or voicemail, but with a ripple. A neighbor stopped me while I was watering the front steps. "Everything all right, Ruth?" he asked, too casually. I looked up. His smile was friendly, but there was something else behind it. Curiosity. Gossip in its Sunday clothes. "I heard some things," he added. "Your boy and grandson, they were at the cafe the other day, arguing like a couple of teenagers." "Something about the house?" I nodded. "It's no longer theirs to worry about." He raised his eyebrows. "Well, good for you, if I may say so." I gave him a polite smile, but inside I felt something else. Not satisfaction, not exactly, just confirmation. That what I'd done had finally started reaching beyond the family walls. That the version of me Thomas and Henry had tried to manage was dissolving into someone I actually recognized. Back inside, I passed the dining room and caught my reflection in the glass cabinet door. For the first time in years, I didn't look like someone waiting to be asked for something. I looked like someone who had already answered. The phone rang around noon. This time, it was Lily. "Grandma?" Her voice was tight. "Did you talk to Dad?" I did. "He came to my apartment last night. He said you were making impulsive decisions, that maybe your doctor should reassess your mental fitness." I sat down. "He said that?" "Yes. He said if you're not of sound mind, the deed transfer could be challenged." I was quiet for a long moment. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said. "Angry, but fine." "Do you think he'll do it?" "I think he's trying to scare us. That's what men do when they feel their grip loosening. They don't admit it. They start calling you irrational." Lily let out a breath. "I told him if he pushed it, I'd speak to the press." I blinked. "The press?" "Well," she said, "I have a friend at the local paper. They're always looking for stories about elder abuse, financial manipulation, legal gray areas." I smiled. "You didn't tell him that, did you?" I told him exactly that. For the first time all week, I laughed. A real, full laugh that came from the belly. "He left pretty fast after that," Lily said. Red in the face. Good. We hung up after a few minutes, but I sat at the table for a long while after. Something was shifting, not just in me, in Lily, too. She was no longer speaking like a granddaughter who'd been past something. She was speaking like a protector. That afternoon, I gathered the documents I'd kept in the hallway drawer. Every receipt, every email, every wire transfer with Thomas's name attached. Years of unspoken transactions. Not because I planned to use them, but because if I needed to, I would. That night, I received a text from Maya. "I don't know what you did, but I heard about it." From Lily. "I just want you to know, I've never been prouder to know you." I stared at it for a long time. Not thank you. Not what did I get. Just proud. That word carried more weight than any inheritance. Later, I sat in Harold's old chair, watching the light dim from room to room. I didn't need music. I didn't need distraction. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd picked it up, placed it back on the shelf, and locked the closet. They could knock on every door they wanted, but I wasn't opening it. Maya showed up 2 days later with a pie and no warning. "You're not the only one who can do doorstep surprises," she said, holding up the tin like a peace offering. I let her in. The smell of cinnamon followed her through the doorway. We sat at the kitchen table like it was any other day, not the quiet aftermath of a storm neither of us had started, but both of us now stood outside of. She poured the tea. I sliced the pie. We didn't rush to talk. "I heard from Lily," she said eventually, her voice careful but not timid. "She told me about the trust, the house, the letters, everything." I nodded. I wasn't planning to keep it from you. I just wanted the dust to settle first. Maya leaned forward, her elbows on the table like a child about to ask something too big. Why me? That question. Always that question. I looked at her face, kind, thoughtful, slightly sunburned even now in the fall, and I realized what I was really seeing, the answer itself. Because the day I had no heat and no one answered their phone, you brought me a blanket and soup without hesitation. You didn't ask me to sign anything. You didn't tell me to call someone else. You just came. Her eyes shimmered. Because when you call, you never ask how much or how soon. You ask if I'm eating, if I'm sleeping, if I need someone to drive me to the market. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. And because, I added softly, you've never once made me feel like my time was expired. She put her hand over mine, and for a long while we sat like that, the pie untouched, the tea cooling. Two women on opposite sides of many things, but not of truth. You didn't have to, she whispered. No, I said. But that's the point. Before she left, I handed her a small envelope. Inside were the initial trust documents she'd be receiving from Walter later that week. I want you to have this now, I said. Not so you'll be grateful. Just so you'll know it's real. She took the envelope, hugged me tighter than she ever had before, and left without another word. Later that evening, I found a message on the answering machine. Mother. Thomas's voice, clipped and low. We need to talk. Not about the documents. About Henry. I stared at the red blinking light as if it could explain itself. Something's wrong, the message continued. He didn't show up for work. He's not answering anyone. If you know where he is, please call. I didn't. I hadn't heard from Henry since the letter I never opened. And even as I reached for the phone, even as instinct curled around me like an old shawl, check in, protect, forgive, I stopped. Because I realized what Thomas hadn't said. He hadn't asked if I was okay, only if I'd heard from his son. I sat down instead, let the phone ring a second time, then a third. This time, I didn't pick up. I wasn't punishing them. I was finally practicing the boundaries they never thought I was strong enough to hold. Outside, the leaves rustled on the birch tree, the sound of change that doesn't ask permission. And in my chest, something that had once been quiet and cold now beat with steady warmth. Not anger, not vengeance, just clarity and peace. I didn't hear from Henry again, not that night, not the next, and I didn't call. That decision sat heavy in me, not out of cruelty, but because I'd finally learned the difference between love and self-abandonment. On the third morning, Lily showed up with 2 coffees and a knit hat she'd found in some secondhand shop. You're going to need this, she said. Winter's coming early this year. I smiled and took it from her hands. Gray, woolen, no frills. Just like me. We sat by the window. I told her about the message from Thomas, about Henry going silent. She listened, then asked carefully, Are you worried? No, I said, but I remember what it feels like to be young and afraid of losing something you were never entitled to. She didn't answer right away, just sipped her coffee, watching the street outside. I keep thinking about what you said, she finally murmured, about being more than a balance sheet. I looked over at her. And? I see them at work all the time. Families who visit too late, say the right things only when there's a form to sign. And then there are the quiet ones. The ones who show up with apples and clean socks, No claims, just care. She paused. I want to be one of the quiet ones. I reached over and touched her hand. You already are. The kettle whistled behind us. I rose slowly, joints clicking in protest, and made us tea while she cleared space on the table, tucking away my paperwork without question. She didn't need to read it. She trusted me. There was a kind of relief in that. The absence of transaction, the presence of presence. When the cups were filled, she asked softly, Do you regret it? I didn't pretend to misunderstand. No, I said, but I regret waiting so long. She nodded. I used to think love meant giving without pause, I continued, letting them take, letting them misstep, because maybe someday they'd see me, understand, apologize. I stirred my tea, but what they understood was that I'd never say no. Lily sat with that for a moment, then asked, And now? Now they know I can. She smiled, small and fierce. Good. That evening, after Lily left, I sat at the table and opened the letter from Henry. I'd almost forgotten it, tucked inside the same drawer where I kept Harold's cufflinks and the church recipes from years ago. The handwriting was neat. Grandma, I messed up. I said things I shouldn't have. I acted like your choices didn't matter. I don't know why. Maybe because I thought I had more time to fix things. Or maybe because I thought you'd always give in. Dad's furious. He says you've ruined everything. But I don't care what he says. I care that I hurt you. I didn't just want the money. I wanted to feel like I mattered. But I went about it all wrong. If you never speak to me again, I understand. But if you do, I'll listen. Really listen. Love, Henry. I read it twice, then a third time. It didn't absolve him. It didn't fix the past. But it didn't ask for anything either. It was the first real thing he'd said to me in years. I placed the letter back into the drawer, not out of sentiment, but because I wasn't ready to decide yet. Forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't have to come with a key to the front door. Sometimes it's enough just to keep the letter, to leave a crack in the window, not swing it open, to say, I heard you. And let that be enough. The first snow came quiet. I woke to the soft light that only comes from a world covered in white. The birch tree outside my window wore a shawl of frost. The road was still. Even the birds had hushed. I stood in the kitchen, cup in hand, watching the day begin like it wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was no storm, no phone call, no knock, just silence. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. A week had passed since I read Henry's letter. I hadn't replied. I hadn't thrown it away either. It sat in my drawer, beside the folder of papers I no longer needed to check twice. I had nothing left to prove. No more rooms to clear with my voice. No more battles to fight, just to remind them I existed. The choices had been made. The money, redirected. The house, transferred. The will, revised. There was a time when that would have scared me. The idea that I'd set it all in motion and couldn't take it back. But now, it felt like breath. Like stepping into a room without holding your stomach in. Later that morning, I got a card in the mail. Handwritten. No return address. It was from the shelter. A thank you. Not for the amount, they never mentioned the figure, but for what it would allow them to do. A heating system, new mattresses, legal assistance for women starting over. I held the card in my hands and thought about all the rooms I'd once sat in, smiling politely, giving too much, asking for too little. All the times I'd been called difficult for saying no, emotional for saying enough, cruel for finally putting myself in the center of the story. Let them call me what they want. I know who I am. Later, I bundled up and walked to the park. The air bit at my cheeks, but I didn't mind. Children were throwing snowballs in the distance. A woman helped her mother into a bench across from mine. Their laughter was small but unmissable. I watched them for a while. Then I closed my eyes. Harold used to say, "Every person should get to choose the ending to their own story." And I had. Not loud, not dramatic, not explosive, but clear, final, true. I gave to those who'd held me without demand. I walked away from those who saw me only as access. And I stayed. In my home. In my body. In my worth. If you're still reading this, if you've felt invisible, pushed aside, dismissed for being too old, too soft, too quiet, let this be your reminder. You're not just someone's mother, or grandmother, or burden. You are the keeper of a life fully lived, and you still get to choose what happens next. If this story meant something to you, share it. Leave a comment, or just send it to someone who's forgotten how much power still lives in their voice. We're not done. Not by a long shot.